Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest Dispatch from the Front. Back to the pandemic world today as we review this USA Today story by Deirdre Shesgreen. Help me bring my daddy home. Months after a man died of COVID-19 overseas, his family can't get his remains. Your dad is dead, too much sick. That blunt, misspelled message is what Carlene Shackman woke up to May 12th. Her father, Charles Piles, 77, a lifelong Kentuckian, had been in the Philippines when he grew ill with COVID-19 and succumbed to the virus. Little did she know those 7 words would be the start of a months-long nightmare that has cost her thousands of dollars, countless tears, and hours of frustrated calls and emails to the U.S. Embassy and members of Congress seeking help with a seemingly simple task: bringing her father's remains back to the U.S. Nothing is simple in a pandemic that has sickened millions of people, slowed global travel, and slashed U.S. Embassy services. I am desperate and heartbroken, Shackman said in an interview Monday, crying as she talked about trying to fulfill her father's final wishes. The State Department has helped bring home thousands of American travelers who became stranded amid the global lockdown when the pandemic began. The agency does not keep statistics on how many Americans have died of COVID-19 abroad. Hundreds of U.S. citizens die annually of various causes, from car accidents to drownings to homicide, an agency database shows. Normally, when Americans die abroad, embassy officials can help with a gamut of tasks, from notifying next of kin to repatriating remains. Shackman said that hasn't happened in her father's case. Shackman leads the family's effort to get Piles' remains home, with the help of her mother, Doris Piles, who lives in Kentucky and was not traveling with her husband. After the initial shock of her husband's death, Doris said she and her daughter thought about next steps. We'll send money and we'll talk to the embassy and everything will be okay, she thought. Well, nothing was okay. Absolutely nothing. They said they feel scammed by the Philippine funeral home that took $4,000 of the family's money, a fee that included repatriation of urn ashes to Kentucky, USA, according to the contract she shared with USA Today. And they feel abandoned by the State Department and U.S. Embassy in Manila, which Shackman beseeched for assistance. Please help me bring my daddy home, Shackman wrote in one email. He is currently sitting in a jar on the shelf of a funeral home that I have never seen nor visited. The U.S. Embassy in Manila referred questions to the State Department in Washington. A State Department official did not address Shackman's specific case. Speaking on the condition of anonymity under the agency's policy, the official said that because of the pandemic, embassies may face delays due to local conditions, availability of necessary foreign government officials, and COVID-19 related logistical challenges. In the case of the Piles family, the delay has lasted 106 days and counting. I want his ashes. I want him back here in the United States, and I know that's what he wants, Doris Piles, 75, said in a phone interview on Wednesday. He didn't want to stay in the Philippines in a box somewhere on a shelf. When the pandemic emerged, Shackman asked her dad to come back to the USA. He had become an avid traveler after retiring from his job as a civil servant at Fort Knox. He loved the Philippines, making it his home away from home with a circle of friends in the expat community there. In early May, some of his friends grew concerned that they had not seen Piles out and about. They went to his apartment and discovered he was seriously ill. Doris Piles said her husband refused to go to the hospital and died soon after that visit. Grief-stricken, the family began making the necessary arrangements. He made it very clear to all the people he loved that what he wanted was to be cremated in the Philippines, have his ashes shipped home to my mother, and have us gather at his parents' grave to scatter his ashes, said Shackman, a U.S. Army veteran who works for Johnson Controls in Missouri. Until that happened, she said, we're all kind of in limbo and unsettled. It's not clear exactly what the holdup is. A representative of the funeral home in the Philippines suggested via email that it had been unable to find an airline that would carry Piles' remains. The funeral home shared copies of text messages and emails with Shackman, in which it denies scamming the family and says it is working with heart and sincerity to help return her father. When Shackman asked the embassy for help, she was told, here's the forms you need, good luck. Shackman contacted her U.S. senators in Missouri, where she lives, and her mother wrote a letter to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. Shackman said the lawmakers sent her and her mother form responses referring her back to the embassy. After USA Today made inquiries with the offices of McConnell and Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, staff from both offices contacted Shackman and vowed to help. Wednesday, Shackman received a text message from one of her father's best friends in the Philippines who has spent months trying to help her. He told her he'd gotten an appointment with the U.S. Embassy for a sign-off of her father's mortuary certificate, and he'd found a flight that would take her father's urn home next week, barring cancellations. Doris Powell said she is ready to pick her husband's ashes up at a moment's notice. All they have to do is call and say there's a package for Doris Powell. She said, I just want him to be home. Okay, so a very sad and disturbing story here about how hard it can be to get home during a pandemic. Now, there's a couple of things to note before we get into kind of the dissection of culture and values that we typically perform on such stories. One of these is this. There are ways to get anything from overseas back to the United States. There's a couple of different things that people are generally not aware of but really should be. Number one is that pilots are allowed to carry a small amount of things with them. And those pilot bags are generally not subject to search and customs. So one option you have if you find yourself in this situation, and depending on the size of the object, I have no idea how big the urn is, but if you can get to a sympathetic pilot, they may be willing to take it with their personal effects flying in and out of the area. That's one option. The airlines often offer a door-to-door shipping option. And if you go to the airline counter at the airport, you can often request this. This happens a lot when somebody takes off and they forget something important, such as, hey, I'm flying overseas and I've left my passport at home. So what do? I get off the plane. I'm going to be stuck in customs. What do? Well, what you do is you have a friend or a relative get your passport from your house or apartment and take it to the airport and have it put on the next flight. And then they carry that out for you. There's a fee for it, but there is a way to get there very quickly, which will enable you to deal with situations such as that. People should be aware of it just in case in extremis they need to avail themselves of it. Another thing to consider is that passenger airlines are not your only option. In this particular case, this gentleman has had his remains reduced to a jar of ashes through cremation. So that could conceivably be sent more as cargo. And that may open up some options because now you don't have to worry just about airlines, which may have their rules about carrying cremains for whatever reason. But if you can get a FedEx or a DHL, something similar for a cargo air shipment, that may be an option. In this case, she's already waited 106 days for this. There are boats going in and out of the Philippines all the time. It can be easier to get it put on a boat and carry and delivered to you that way. Obviously, boats are always traversing the Pacific. The Philippines is one of the common naval port stops, and you might be able to do it that way. There may be a way to actually go to the Philippines and pick them up yourself if you have to, and then bring them back. But what's sad in all this is that the embassy, whose sole job really is to deal with these kind of concerns of Americans traveling abroad, the embassy doesn't seem to be helping much. And I'll give you another option that should be available. I'm not sure why it isn't, which is that the embassy could dispatch somebody, go pick up the cremains, and then bring it back with the ambassador. Obviously, they can pretty much carry whatever they want because, the world recognizes the rights of ambassadors and diplomatic pouches cannot be opened. So worst comes to worst, that could be an option, I'm not sure why they haven't offered to do that. But let's talk now beyond the logistics of it and what it says about our values, this whole mess. Number one, he was on vacation. He got sick on vacation. He chose not to go to the hospital. No doubt he knew enough about COVID-19 to know when it became an advanced case, there probably wasn't much they were going to be able to do for him in the Philippines anyway. And so he chose to meet his fate over there. Obviously was not the preferred place for his demise, but that's what he chose to do. For whatever reason, he would rather pass away over there in the Philippines than kind of make an all-out bid for either recovery or to come home. So that tells you something about the values that that he had. He was 77 years old. He apparently decided to face his fate with dignity. Let's consider another thing implicit in this story was the importance of someone's final requests when they're facing death. In the United States, this extends to a large extent even to convicted prisoners who are facing the death penalty. Before they go, they are granted, within some limits, a last meal. There's a last request that's honored when it can be. And we place a tremendous importance upon an individual being able to settle their affairs before they leave this mortal coil. You see this also in things such as the Make-A-Wish Foundation, where terminally ill children are granted a wish before they pass. And these can be a lot of different things. Down the road at the Air Force Academy, for example, when my son and I ate with the cadet wing as part of our reunion activities, they had a boy there who was taking part in the Cadet for a Day program. Terminally ill child. His wish was to be a cadet. And so they set something up special so that he could fulfill his wish. So you think about it as kind of a bucket list for terminally ill children. You see this in other forms. It's become, in this age of the ready availability of camera recording equipment, that sometimes when people are terminally ill and they have a little time, they leave messages, especially if their kids aren't grown or if their grandchildren aren't grown, and they want to leave a tangible reminder of themselves. They record some of these messages for posterity. Often these are timed to special events such as birthdays or anniversaries, and meant to be played in order. So we take very seriously the dignity of the individual in how they choose to leave this life. Obviously, the United States is a religious country. And so often, religions have preferences as to how we do things. For example, I am a Catholic. In the Catholic Church, while cremation is allowed, it is generally frowned upon. Yes, we do have some churches which have columbaria, which are these cement walls or columns into which cremains may be placed for lack of space or what have you. But typically the expectation is you will have a funeral and it will consist of inhumation, by which we mean your remains will be placed in a casket. The casket will be placed in the ground or in a mortuary vault of some sort. And this tradition likely goes back to the catacombs in Rome, where the skeletal remains of many an early Christian may be found to this very day. We revere the artifacts of the saints, including their very bones. And so, for those reasons, for reasons of tradition, that's how we tend to pursue it. In other religions, cremation is valid, if not desirable. I'm not sure what Mr. Pyle's religion was. It may have been it didn't much matter because when you succumb during a pandemic, they need to sterilize the body, and cremation certainly does that. So it may have been simply impossible to repatriate his whole body, except in the case of, I don't know, a lead-lined casket or something like that. You don't want the virus getting out and infecting other people, right? So it says something about our values that we even attempt to get somebody's remains back. Here in America, we believe in the ancient point of view that not only should the deceased be able to determine what is done with their remains, but we have a belief that you should be buried in your home soil. It's an interesting thing. For those of us that are veterans, we often have a choice of where we're buried. You could be buried in a veteran cemetery. You could be buried, for those who had particularly heroic service, in Arlington Cemetery. You could, in the case of Service Academy graduates such as myself, you could be buried in the cemetery associated with your academy. And it leads to, sometimes a conflict of values, because we also believe that generally families should be interred together. In this topsy-turvy world where divorce is so prevalent, it can be difficult to determine which family to be buried with. Perhaps the last one you were on good terms with is the determining factor. But the notion, and it is an ancient notion, is that you want your physical remains to be placed near those you have some strong bond with. It's not considered to be as desirable to be interred around strangers. Sometimes this can mean placing your remains or you're scattering your ashes in an area which is important to you. When they say that he wanted to have his ashes scattered over his parents' graves, it was clear that, while he may have preferred to be interred with them, this would be the next best thing. In other cases, it's a particular tradition among sailors for bodies of water they were particularly fond of to scatter their ashes nearby, sometimes those with the most breathtaking view, for example. In some cases, cremains in particular are kept by the family, placed over a fireplace or in a place of honor within the home. So it creates a feeling that the deceased are still with us in some fundamental way. You can learn a lot about a people by how they treat their dead, what their perspective is on life and death. And in this case, it's very clear that Mr. Pyle's family very clearly values his wishes and are going to great lengths to try and honor them. It is clear as well that the U.S. Embassy does not value the wishes of American travelers and expats in the Philippines, and only lurches into action when the press starts to write a story, as in this case. It's clear as well that the congressional staffs, in this case, those of the Senate Majority Leader and those of a minority member of the House, well, they don't take action unless the media starts sniffing about. And then you look bad if you don't respond to a constituent's concern. So with Corona on everyone's minds, and certainly anyone can empathize with somebody traveling overseas when the epidemic hit and then succumbing to it, and empathize with their family trying to get them back home. Why is it that these bureaucrats and elected officials have no empathy until prodded to such by the media? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? These are the people claiming to be looking out for our best interest. These are the people who have cast aside the Constitution of the United States and our rights given by God protected within that document because this virus is just such a threat. You would expect them to be highly attuned to the human tragedy that springs up in the wake of the virus's transmission. And yet, in this case, they're late to the game, almost as though they hadn't considered it at all. I can bet you one thing, that if it were a member of their family, or perhaps a wealthy contributor who needed to get back home after having succumbed in a foreign country, you can bet that they would move heaven and earth to bring them home. And that says something very disturbing about American values at present. It speaks of the notion of we are not a nation of laws, but a mere nation of men. And your surname and your genetics will determine just how much benefit you get from a government so constituted. In any case, here's wishing that Mr. Piles comes home to those who love them, who love him, sooner rather than later, and that his human remains may rest in that Kentucky soil rather than sit on a shelf forgotten in a Philippine funeral home. God bless the Pyle family, and have a great day.